Well, naturally, in my speech, I will focus on Russia. So you see the name, it's pretty short. Russia before and after COP26. In a sense, COP26 in Glasgow may feel like a watershed. And I think it's useful for us to take a look at how Russia approached the Glasgow summit and what we can expect going forward. Well, Russia is still associated with gas, oil, with hydrocarbons, and such as, well, coal as well. And it's hard denying it. We are supplying lots of them to international clients. At the same time, Russia is pretty serious about international climate agenda. Well, in fact, our low carbon economic and social development strategy was developed in time for COP26. And what's good for Russia is that we now have a vision for how the country should develop. Now, this is figures in retrospect. It actually shows the evolution of this country for the past, 30 years. And we can actually see that GHG emissions stand at roughly half of what we had back in 1990. 1,585 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And methane there plays an important role at 15%. And we're very much concerned about it, and we are going to address it, just like we're going to address power sector issues. It's important to remember that in this country, LULUCF plays a very important role. Actually, Russian forests absorb roughly 25% of all emissions. However, the problem is such that since 2010, the actual absorption by Russian forests, according to actually Russia's own estimates, has been going down. And if we do nothing about it, we can assume that eventually LULUCF will provide a negative contribution to emission reduction rather than a positive one. Another factor to remember about Russia is that our trajectory of development is very unusual for the world. Now, what you see here are drivers which explain CO2 emissions for Russia on the left, for the world on the right. We can see, for example, that for the world as a whole, for the past 30 years, CO2 emissions went up by more than 60%, right? And it has been primarily driven by the growth in population and growth in GDP per capita. And the only factor that pulled it down was energy intensity of GDP, while carbon intensity of energy barely budged over these 30 years. And we all know that some countries have made colossal strides in terms of deployment of renewables. In some countries, renewables account for a major share of electricity output. However, for the whole world, carbon intensity of energy has not really changed much over the past 30 years. It's just a statistical fact. All this is different for Russia. Naturally, in the 1990s, we saw a major decrease in emissions. And in fact, our total emissions today are still well below the level of 1990. Our population has not changed much, that of Russia at least. So the only driver of our emissions has been the growth of Russia's economy. At the same time, carbon intensity of energy as well as energy intensity of GDP have been going down. So you can actually see that the orange line dropped by roughly 15%. So Russia's energy is getting greener. We are showing here average carbon intensity of a kilowatt hour in Russia compared to other countries. Well, we can actually see here that electricity in Russia is relatively clean. I mean, Russia is not as good on that particular count compared to an average European country, though we are way better than Poland, Greece, or Netherlands, or Czech Republic. But if we compare Russia to other large countries outside the EU, we'll see that the carbon footprint of our electricity is significantly lower, which may feel good, but it shouldn't, because it actually means that most of the low-hanging fruits in terms of decreasing carbon intensity of energy have already been plucked. And indeed, hydro and nuclear power plants play a pretty important role in our electricity outputs. Yes, there are some coal-fired plants as well, and they need to be shifted out, but it's going to take time. All right, one more thing I had to mention here. When we see no progress in terms of carbon intensity of energy, it should explain why politicians are so ecstatic about low carbon technologies. Because they really want to change the scene, so to speak, because, for the past 30 years, the world has not been able to do that. And, whenever we read about a new renewables project, which provides, very low cost electricity, and yet another record is set by doing this, this is great. But the thing is that all countries are special. Some countries are endowed with great environments for wind or solar power or what have you. Some are not. And if you look at the actual investment projects in Russian electricity generation, you will discover that in terms of how much it costs for Russian companies to reduce carbon footprint in generation, nothing can beat nuclear power plants. NPVs in Russia are the least costly. They're actually very close to gas-fired power plants. In terms of saving emissions, hydropower plants are nearly 50% more expensive, while renewables are nearly 10 times more expensive than NPVs in terms of cost per ton of CO2 saved. So it's not surprising that Russia is so interested in nuclear energy. It is one of those reasons why Russia keeps insisting on technological neutrality, arguing that what matters is the amount of emissions, not how we achieve them, or how we achieve the reductions. And when we talk about prospects, naturally, we will pin our hopes on the development of the nuclear power industry. So Russia came to COP26 with a long-term development strategy, assuming low carbon intensity. In fact, this strategy provides for two scenarios only. One is effectively BAU, business as usual, and it calls for an increase in our GHG emissions. The only point of having this scenario in the first place is to illustrate what we don't want to have. And the other scenario is the baseline or target scenario, in line with which our GHG emissions should go down from 1585 to 630 million tons of CO2 equivalent, including the contribution of LULUCF. In this slide, you can actually see an overview of how these numbers should be achieved in line with this scenario. So you will see that LULUCF will provide, or at least we hope as a country, to get that much from LULUCF. Other important factors include power sector and buildings, fugitive emissions, and waste management. All the other areas, including EVs or electrification, if you like, of the metals industry, they are certainly important and they need to be addressed. But in terms of their contribution, they pale in comparison to the other levers I have already mentioned. An important feature of this target scenario is that this is something that Russia can actually afford financially. We've done our assessments, which show that the capital intensity of this scenario is bearable for Russia. And this is the case because we have been able to achieve a balance here between developing the ecosystem and deploying fancy new technologies. This is a snapshot of our future power sector in line with the target scenario. Note pretty robust growth in demand for electricity. It's actually a feature of most scenarios that we have in many countries. Low carbon development is about electrifying pretty much everything you can electrify. That's why we are using the same assumption here. So you can see that most of this new demand will be satisfied with low carbon solutions, primarily nuclear, like I said. But you will also see that roughly 11% of total outputs in 2050 will come from renewables. You will see that the share of coal will drop from 12% today to roughly 5% in 2050. And actually, this scenario calls for installation of CCUS units at coal-fired power plants in order to reduce their carbon footprint. Such a development of the power sector will necessarily involve increase in electricity prices. But again, Russia can only afford this shift only if Russia is enjoying economic growth and development. Я бы хотел акцентировать внимание на те темы, которые поднимались на конференции. I would like to highlight here the subjects that were raised at COP26, particularly those where some progress was made. So Russia certainly has ascended to this agreement to end deforestation, and Russia seems to be pretty serious about developing its LULUCF industry. It's already part of Russia's strategy, in fact. It won't be easy, but we are keen on doing that. Second thrust, so to speak, is to slash methane emissions, most of which are fugitive. And like I said, the target scenario is very serious about tackling fugitive emissions. So here we hope that Russia will make a sizable contribution to reducing global GHG emissions. Next, Russia is going to phase down using unabated coal. And the previous slide showed that Russia is going to reduce its coal-fired generation to 5%. And finally, want to secure global net zero by mid-century. By 2060. So the way Russia's strategy was developed was sort of based on the assumption that Russia would reach net zero by 2060. It is indeed a target in the current strategy. So in a sense, we can say that our strategy, which was adopted 2 weeks prior to Glasgow, sort of, reflects many of the agreements reached in Glasgow, which hopefully shows how good Russian modelers are at predicting such events. Now, the question I want to ask myself and ourselves here is like this. Now, the scenarios for reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, how affordable and how realistic are they? So we have tried calculating energy prices for an economy that would be sufficient for the economy to actually pay for all these energy transition projects, because you need to raise funding. You also need to repay all this debt, all these loans. And then you actually need to take this money somewhere. Like you need to get some payback, maybe through increased prices. So on the left, you see some individual countries and the world as a whole shown in the right. So you will see that for all countries, energy prices as a share of GDP exceed 10% for all the countries. And for some countries, it's particularly pronounced. And there are actually studies which show that whenever your energy expenses exceed 10 or 11%, economic growth stops. And this kind of studies show that such a technological way to carbon neutrality by 2050 may be impossible. That's why we believe we need to manage the ecosystems as well, and we need to be very mindful of the economic conundrum involved. This should be it. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Andrey.